Take a deep breath. And let the world around you begin to soften. You've had a long day. The kind that blurs around the edges. The kind that leaves you wishing for something quiet, something simple. So, here we are again, gently peeling back the curtain of time, reaching toward a distant past. A time before electricity, before microwaves and mobile phones. A time when survival was a skill, not a guarantee. Tonight, we'll walk in the shoes of someone who rarely had time to rest. Not a knight, not a king, not a wandering bard, but a servant. Not the noble, pampered kind, but the ones who awoke before the sunrise to stoke the hearths, scrub the floors, fetch the water, and bear the weight of an entire household's comfort on their shoulders. Their names were rarely remembered, their toil rarely thanked. And their days? They were long, grueling, and endlessly repetitive. This is the quiet, overlooked world of the medieval servant, a world without weekends, without rights, and without much mercy. Yet it was a role that countless people lived and endured, shaping the very foundation of castle life, manor life, and village routine across the medieval world. If you're ready, we'll gently fall back into this forgotten rhythm. Listen for the crackle of a hearth fire. Picture the gray mist of dawn. Feel the cold stone beneath bare feet. And as we begin, I invite you to take this moment to settle in. Loosen your shoulders. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let your thoughts slow to a trickle. If you enjoy wandering through these sleepy corridors of history with us, feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a quiet comment when you wake. We'd love to know when, and where, you're listening from. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan. And let's begin. Long before the first rays of sunlight slipped over the stone walls of a medieval manor, the day had already begun for the servant. In the stillness of pre-dawn, when the world outside remained shrouded in mist and silence, the quiet stirrings of those at the very bottom of the household hierarchy were already underway. There were no soft alarm bells, no gentle stretches beneath warm duvets. Instead, the body jolted awake from the stiffness of a straw mattress, limbs sore from yesterday's labors, and the air biting cold against skin that had never known the luxury of central heating. The moment the servant opened their eyes, the weight of obligation came crashing down like a familiar stone. There was water to haul from the well, fires to stoke, floors to sweep, and commands to anticipate before the masters of the house even thought to open their eyes. Rising late, even by a matter of minutes, meant drawing the ire of the steward or head servant, and perhaps more severe consequences depending on the household's rules and the master's temperament. The first task of the morning was often a brutal introduction to the day. Most servants began by rushing to light the fires in every occupied room, a task that required not only gathering kindling from wherever it had been stored, sometimes outside in the damp, but also managing to coax a flame into existence using flint and steel, or with embers saved from the night before. The house had to be warm before its noble occupants rose, and if the servant failed in this task, there was little patience for excuses. Fire starting in a medieval manor wasn't a romantic, crackling affair. It was a struggle with soot-covered hands, freezing fingers, and damp firewood that often hissed more than it burned. A servant who couldn't get a fire going fast enough might be met with scolding or dismissal, even though the conditions were far from ideal. Once the hearths were lit and the rooms warming, the servant had to move swiftly to their next task, fetching water. This meant trudging, often barefoot or in rough, worn shoes, through mud, snow, or frost toward a communal well, stream, or rain barrel, carrying heavy buckets that would strain even the strongest arms. In some estates, the water source could be several minutes away, and the journey back was made even more difficult by the sloshing weight and the need to avoid spillage. The water was used for washing, cooking, and sometimes even for drinking, though many households preferred ale, as it was considered safer than often contaminated well water. By the time the household awoke, the servant had already completed a small list of thankless chores that were essential to the smooth functioning of the manor, but rarely acknowledged by anyone above them. After the fires and water came the floors. Stone, packed earth, or wooden planks had to be swept clear of dust, straw, and the grime that came from a time when people tracked everything indoors: mud, manure, bits of hay, or worse. Cleaning was done without modern conveniences, no vacuums, no mops, not even soap in many cases. Just a stiff broom, some elbow grease, and perhaps a bit of sand to scrub away persistent filth. The smell inside many manors was a combination of smoke, sweat, animal hair, and whatever had spilled or rotted the day before. Servants were expected to make the home presentable for their masters while enduring conditions that would send a modern cleaner running. Their own quarters, meanwhile, were never cleaned by others. If a servant wanted a fresh bed or clean linens, which were rare luxuries anyway, they would have to make time between their duties to tend to themselves. More often, there was simply no time. Breakfast was not a moment of rest or enjoyment for the servant. In fact, it usually wasn't served to them until long after the household had eaten. The morning meal had to be prepared and served with precision. Porridge was common among both the wealthy and the poor, but the difference was in the ingredients. A noble's porridge might be enriched with cream, spices, dried fruits, and sweeteners like honey or imported sugar. The servants, if they got any at all, received the plainest version, usually watery, sometimes scorched, and only after it had cooled. Food preparation required hours of labor. Bread had to be kneaded and baked in large ovens, eggs gathered and cooked, meat spitted and turned slowly over fires. This was especially true on feast days or Sundays, when the household might expect a lavish display of wealth at the table. Servants rarely tasted the food they prepared, and they certainly couldn't snack on it. Stealing food, even just a bite, could mean punishment or dismissal. Hierarchy among the servants themselves added another layer of stress. There was a strict pecking order, and woe to the new or lowest-ranking servant who failed to understand it. At the top might be a steward or a housekeeper, often older, more experienced servants who had gained a degree of authority and trust from the lord or lady. Beneath them came various ranks: cooks, maids, scullery workers, stable hands, and general laborers. A young boy or girl just entering service might find themselves cleaning chamber pots, scrubbing the rough wooden privies, or running errands across the estate all day. Mistakes were not tolerated, and training was often more about enduring criticism than receiving instruction. Many children entered service at 10 or 11 years old, having already been hardened by poverty, hunger, or orphanhood, and were expected to work like adults from day one. Servants had little time to themselves, and almost no concept of privacy. Even in sleep, they were never truly off duty. Most slept in communal quarters, attics, basements, or near the kitchens, where cold drafts were common and pests even more so. Rats and fleas were constant companions, as were the aches and coughs of those too exhausted to recover. If a master rang a bell or sent for help in the middle of the night, the servant had to rise without complaint. There were no weekends or holidays unless the entire estate shut down, and even religious festivals often meant more work, not less. On feast days, the kitchen boiled with activity, the fires burned hotter, and the demands for excellence grew more intense. Medical care was nearly non-existent for those of lower status. A servant who twisted an ankle, burned a hand, or fell ill from exhaustion would be expected to continue working unless they were completely incapacitated. And if they couldn't work, they risked being replaced. There were always more peasants looking for a roof over their heads and a bowl of porridge, even if it meant a life of drudgery. The vulnerability of the servant was constant and suffocating. Their survival depended not on fairness or justice but on obedience, strength, and luck. Kind masters were the exception, not the rule. Many saw servants as extensions of the household tools, valuable only for their usefulness, not their humanity. Despite this bleak routine, some found small moments of connection or purpose in their roles. A close friendship with a fellow servant, a rare nod of approval from the master, or even a quiet sunrise glimpsed from the kitchen door could offer a brief spark of comfort. But these moments were fleeting. More often, the day blurred into another cycle of labor, fatigue, and submission. The hours rolled forward, dominated by bells and brooms, heat and hunger. And it all began, every single day, before the rooster even had a chance to crow. As the morning light grew stronger, and the household began to stir with signs of nobility, and their families rising, the work of the medieval servant only intensified. There was no opportunity to rest after those first pre-dawn duties. In fact, those early tasks were simply the warm-up for a day that stretched long into the evening hours with no guarantee of pause. The servants' world was dictated not by clocks, which few could afford or read, but by the sun's position, the tolling of bells, and the constant, ever-shifting whims of the masters they served. From the moment the fires were lit and water hauled in the bitter morning, the day transformed into a relentless sequence of obligations, one chore leading into another with barely a moment to breathe in between. Each task was physical, repetitive, and mentally draining, designed to maintain the comfort of others while often eroding the comfort, health, and spirit of those performing them. Laundry alone was a monumental task that demanded incredible effort and patience. Far removed from the quiet hum of modern washing machines, laundry day in a medieval household meant hauling more water, heating it over a fire, and scrubbing heavy garments by hand using harsh soaps made from animal fat and ash. Clothes had to be beaten, boiled, wrung out, and hung to dry, often in unpredictable weather that could turn clean laundry into soiled rags in a single gust of wind. The garments of the noble family were not simple cotton tunics or modest shifts. They were layered, delicate, and often made from expensive fabrics that required extra care. If a servant damaged a piece of clothing, they could expect to be scolded, docked in pay, or worse. Meanwhile, their own clothing was often limited to a single or perhaps two simple sets of linen, rarely washed and always worn threadbare. After laundry came the sweeping, polishing, and dusting of nearly every surface within the manor or household. While it might seem like a smaller task in comparison, medieval homes were not built to stay clean. The drafty stone walls let in moisture and grime. Guests and family tracked dirt indoors constantly. Fireplaces belched smoke that left soot on walls and ceilings. Floors were rarely covered, and if they were, it was often with rushes or straw, materials that absorbed waste, food scraps, and spilled drink, becoming breeding grounds for fleas and mold. Servants had to change these rushes frequently and sweep underneath, often uncovering foul surprises in the process. Every hearth, window, stairwell, and hall needed attention, not just for the sake of cleanliness, but also to display the wealth and orderliness of the master's home to visitors and neighbors. In larger households or castles, specific servants were assigned to cleaning chamber pots and maintaining the latrines, tasks that were among the most detested but were nonetheless essential to the smooth function of daily life. These duties involved emptying waste receptacles filled with the night's results and transporting them away from the home to designated dumping areas, often near cesspits or outside village borders. The stench was overpowering, the job filthy beyond imagination, and no protective equipment existed to shield the servant from the splashes, the mess, or the long-term effects on their health. Skin infections, respiratory issues, and chronic illnesses were common among those tasked with dealing with human waste. And yet, to complain was to risk everything, for there were always others willing to take on the dirtiest tasks in exchange for shelter and bread. Kitchen work was no reprieve either. In fact, it was one of the busiest sectors in the household. Servants assigned to the kitchens endured punishing hours in extreme heat, bent over fires, boiling cauldrons, and turning meat on heavy spits. The tools were basic, the heat relentless, and injuries common. Burns, cuts, and blisters were regular occurrences, often treated with homemade poultices or ignored altogether. The preparation of a single meal might take half the day, with ingredients requiring labor-intensive processing, grains to be ground, vegetables to be peeled and chopped, meats to be butchered, and sauces to be stirred continuously to avoid burning. On feast days or when entertaining guests, the scale of food preparation expanded enormously, sometimes requiring dozens of staff to prepare multi-course meals that had to be presented with elaborate flair. The food had to be not just edible, but impressive, and any mistake in seasoning or presentation could lead to verbal humiliation or a cut in wages. Cleaning up after meals was just as arduous. With no running water, servants had to return to the well or water source again and again, bringing buckets to rinse dishes, pots, and utensils. These were often made of heavy materials, iron, bronze, or wood, and could be cumbersome when greasy or soiled with thick sauces and burnt food. The washing process required sand or harsh cleaning materials and could take hours. Afterward, everything had to be dried by hand, inspected for cleanliness, and stored in a specific order to avoid the displeasure of the head cook or steward. Any broken item had to be accounted for, sometimes with compensation expected from the servant responsible for the accident, even if it was due to worn-out materials or overcrowded kitchens. Outside the household, many servants were tasked with outdoor labor, gathering firewood, collecting herbs, tending gardens, or assisting in the stables. These duties were no less taxing and were made more difficult by weather conditions and the sheer physical strain involved. Carrying bundles of wood over long distances, mucking out stalls, trimming hedges with dull tools, and maintaining fences or livestock pens required strength and endurance. Stable hands, in particular, faced unique challenges, as horses had to be brushed, fed, watered, and exercised regularly. Cleaning the stalls meant dealing with manure, parasites, and strong ammonia smells that stung the eyes and lungs. Injuries from kicks, bites, or falls were not uncommon, and those who worked in the stables were often treated with less respect than those serving within the manor's walls. One of the most invisible but grueling roles of all was that of the scullery maid or boy. Typically young and inexperienced, these servants handled all the most demeaning and repetitive tasks: scraping plates, scouring pans, carrying waste, and fetching anything needed on a moment's notice. Their hands were perpetually raw from scrubbing, their backs bent from carrying heavy loads, and their minds dulled from exhaustion and lack of sleep. Scullery workers were often at the mercy of the entire staff hierarchy, shouted at by cooks, dismissed by higher-ranking servants, and sometimes overlooked entirely in the household records. They were seen as replaceable, and their hard work was rarely acknowledged unless something went wrong. These were the servants most likely to fall ill from overwork and malnutrition, and the least likely to receive any form of kindness from those above them. The social dynamic among servants could be tense and competitive. While they shared many of the same hardships, there was often rivalry for better positions, more favorable hours, or the rare opportunity for advancement. A servant who displayed reliability, strength, or pleasing manners might be considered for more prestigious roles such as a personal maid, footman, or valet. These positions came with slightly better quarters, closer proximity to the masters, and perhaps the occasional discarded garment or leftover meal. However, they also came with constant scrutiny and higher expectations. A personal servant was expected to anticipate the master's needs, remember every preference, and be ever-present yet invisible. The pressure of such roles could be immense, and failure meant immediate demotion. Religious obligations added another layer of complexity to the daily routine. Many noble households were deeply devout, and servants were expected to observe religious customs even while working from dawn until nightfall. They might be required to attend early morning prayers, fast on holy days, and observe a strict moral code enforced by the household's spiritual advisor or chaplain. At the same time, they were expected to labor without complaint, regardless of physical weakness or spiritual fatigue. Servants were often caught between two sets of expectations: spiritual obedience and physical obedience, both of which demanded submission, discipline, and self-denial. Their own spiritual needs, if they had any time to reflect on them, were often neglected in the constant rush of chores and survival. There was no such thing as a work-life balance in the medieval world of servitude. The home was the workplace, and the workplace was a prison of expectations and constant motion. Servants had no privacy, no time for personal pursuits, and no assurance that tomorrow's work would not break them in body or spirit. They could be dismissed at any time for reasons as trivial as breaking a dish, being too slow with a task, or even being the target of a master's bad mood. Contracts, if they existed, were rarely enforced in favor of the servant. Many lived with the constant threat of homelessness if they lost their position, and those with nowhere to go might find themselves on the road, begging, or entering even more dangerous forms of work just to stay alive. Yet in all of this, servants endured. Not because they were stronger or more resilient by nature, but because they had no other choice. Life in the medieval period for the poor and landless offered few alternatives. Farming one's own land was rare unless inherited. Joining the clergy required education. Becoming an apprentice required a fee or family connections. For many, servitude was the only option that guaranteed food, shelter, and the distant hope, however faint, of a better future. It was a gamble with health, safety, and dignity, but one they took every single day with bowed heads and blistered hands. The sun might have risen by now, casting its light across the stone walls and warming the edges of the manor's great hall. But for the servant, there was no warmth in sight. Only the next task, the next command, the next unspoken expectation. The day had barely begun, and already, their body ached with the knowledge that rest was many, many hours away. As the day stretched further into its long, unforgiving rhythm, the heart of the servant's burden revealed itself not only in the endless list of tasks but in the fragile and often unpredictable art of serving their masters directly. Unlike the backbreaking chores of hauling water, scrubbing floors, or stoking fires, which could at least be performed in relative solitude or the company of fellow servants, waiting hand and foot on the nobility brought with it a different sort of exhaustion, one rooted in mental vigilance, emotional restraint, and a constant need for perfection. To serve in the presence of the master or mistress meant walking a fine, invisible line where one wrong glance, a poorly timed step, or the simplest mistake in etiquette could bring swift reprimand. While nobles lived in a world gilded with power and entitlement, the servants who orbited them became living instruments of convenience, seen, but only when needed, heard, but only when spoken to, and valued, but only for their usefulness. Serving the master began the moment the household awoke. A personal servant, perhaps a valet, a lady's maid, or an attendant, would quietly knock at the chamber door just before dawn if summoned, bearing a bowl of warm water and a rough cloth for washing. There was no soap in the modern sense, just lye or ash-based solutions that stung the skin and left little in the way of comfort. The servant had to carefully arrange garments in the precise order the master preferred, helping to lace boots or gowns, fasten cloaks, and present jewelry or belts without faltering. The entire process demanded a silent fluency in the household's unspoken rules, knowing not to make eye contact at the wrong moment, anticipating the master's next move, avoiding any topic that might trigger displeasure, and moving quickly enough to be efficient but slowly enough to appear composed. Each noble had their own habits, moods, and expectations, which might shift depending on the weather, a letter received that morning, or the quality of last night's sleep. A servant might be expected to listen to complaints without responding, to stand still for hours during a dressing ritual, or to fetch and carry items repeatedly as a noble changed their mind. There was no praise for doing these things correctly, only scorn if they were done poorly. In many households, the relationship between noble and servant was steeped in centuries of reinforced hierarchy and reinforced by religious and legal structures that declared the servant's place as not only lower in status but fundamentally lesser in worth. This belief bled into daily interactions, where a harsh word, a slap, or a thrown object was considered acceptable discipline rather than cruelty. Meals offered another arena where this subtle performance of obedience unfolded. At breakfast, lunch, and especially at supper, the grandest meal of the day, servants moved through the dining hall with the precision of a silent dance. Trained to memorize the preferences of each guest, they stood at the ready to pour wine, present dishes, and clean up any messes without delay. Silence was often required, and some households enforced strict rules that prevented servants from speaking even to one another while in the dining room. They were expected to blend into the background unless needed and to bear any insult with a bowed head and a calm expression. Food had to be served in a specific order, first to the master, then to the highest-ranking guests, and so on, and any deviation from this order was considered an affront to the house's reputation. Even the way bread was sliced or wine decanted was governed by custom, and if a servant failed to uphold these traditions, they could be replaced without ceremony. In more elaborate households, serving the master also meant managing personal affairs with an almost secretarial precision. A trusted servant might be asked to organize correspondence, relay messages to other estates, or even spy on other members of the household. These roles required a delicate balance of loyalty and discretion. Servants who failed to keep secrets, or who were suspected of speaking out of turn, risked more than just dismissal. They could be beaten, locked away, or forced into the streets with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Some became scapegoats when politics turned sour within the family, bearing the brunt of accusations to shield the noble's reputation. Others were compelled to keep silent about affairs, disputes, or crimes they had witnessed, knowing that their survival depended on complicity. The emotional strain of serving such volatile and entitled figures was immense. Servants had to learn to mask their emotions, hide their frustrations, and suppress any sense of self. A day in service required not only physical endurance but the ability to disappear into one's role, to wear a calm face even when insulted, and to remain deferential even when treated unfairly. For many, the hardest part was the lack of acknowledgement. There was no gratitude, no connection, no validation. A servant could work for a household for decades and still be dismissed without a word of thanks or a coin for the road. Loyalty was expected, not rewarded, and mistakes were remembered long after good service was forgotten. Attending to the children of the household introduced yet another layer of complexity. Governesses, nursemaids, and tutors walked a tightrope of authority and obedience. They were expected to discipline the children without upsetting the parents, to educate them without overstepping their social position, and to serve as both caretaker and invisible presence. Noble children were raised to see servants as beneath them, and they often mimicked the scorn or disdain they witnessed in their parents. A nursemaid who spent years raising a child might find herself dismissed when the child came of age, replaced without sentiment or farewells. Yet during their tenure, they were expected to remain endlessly patient, enduring tantrums, illnesses, and nighttime fears with no rest and little recognition. The constant emotional restraint required of servants often created an internal world of quiet rebellion, feelings that could never be voiced and must always be concealed. Some servants found small ways to reclaim a sense of dignity, perhaps in private moments with fellow workers, in whispered jokes behind the kitchen door, or in the satisfaction of a task completed to perfection. Others bore silent resentment, knowing they could never act on it. And some became hardened by the years, transforming into stern senior staff who enforced the same rigid expectations they had once endured. The servant class was not a unified community of camaraderie. It was a network of ranks and rivalries, of unspoken grievances and fragile alliances, all shaped by the ever-present tension of proximity to power. Even the clothes worn by servants marked their status. Most households required them to dress in simple, durable fabrics, often in colors associated with humility, grays, browns, or faded blues. These garments were provided by the household, and were not the servant's own property. They had to be returned in good condition, repaired constantly, and replaced only at the discretion of the master. While nobles wore silk, fur, and embroidery, servants moved through the halls in rough-spun wool, aprons stained from use, and shoes patched multiple times. Even their appearance was expected to reflect their subservience, neat, clean, but never too fine, lest they be accused of vanity or presumption. In the private chambers of the master, a personal servant was often exposed to intimate details, conversations overheard, tears shed, illnesses witnessed. These moments revealed the vulnerability of even the most powerful nobles, yet the servant had to pretend not to notice. They could not react to pain, to scandal, or to weakness. They had to remain steady and quiet, always ready with a cloth, a tray, or a whispered reassurance, while never once stepping beyond the boundary of their role. This level of emotional control was cultivated through experience, and often came at the cost of a servant's own well-being. They carried the burdens of others without ever being asked how they themselves were managing. The daily experience of serving the master was a relentless loop of preparation, anticipation, and reaction. It demanded a mind that was always alert, a body that never flagged, and a spirit that could not break, no matter how heavy the load became. The constant pressure to please, to anticipate, and to disappear was exhausting in a way that physical labor alone could never match. It required a surrender of self, a giving up of autonomy, opinion, and even identity. For many, years passed in this quiet submission, the lines between their own desires and their master's needs becoming so blurred that they no longer knew who they were outside of service. And yet, in all this, life continued. The master's cup was filled. their clothes were pressed. Their meals were served, and their moods soothed. The servant stood just behind the curtain, just out of sight, always present, and always prepared. To the noble, their comfort seemed effortless, their household ran as if by magic. But behind the scenes, it was the servant who made everything possible, at a cost no one cared to acknowledge. In this way, the act of serving the master became not just a task, but an identity, a burden, and a quiet endurance passed from one tired hand to the next, generation after generation. After a long day of service, when the fires had been extinguished, the floors swept clean, the meals served and cleared, and the master's final instructions had been carried out, the world of the medieval servant did not transition into comfort or rest. It transitioned into another kind of survival, a quieter, colder, and lonelier one. The servants' quarters were not sanctuaries but necessary shelters, spaces designed not for recovery but for containment. These rooms were tucked away behind kitchens, below stairs, in drafty attics, or beside storage cellars. They were invisible to the eyes of the household's noble residents, and intentionally separated from the parts of the home meant for elegance, entertainment, and power. Here, in the shadows of the manor or castle, servants lay their heads not to dream, but to forget for a few hours the pain of their feet, the ache in their backs, and the hunger that often lingered even after a day of labor. Servants rarely had rooms of their own. Space was a luxury reserved for their employers, and privacy was nearly non-existent. Bunks or straw pallets were lined up side by side, often separated only by wooden dividers if the household was particularly generous. In smaller homes or crowded estates, servants sometimes slept directly on the floor, their only comfort a blanket, and whatever warmth could be found from a shared fire or body heat. The air in these quarters was thick with the smells of unwashed clothing, old food, smoke, and illness. The walls, if present at all, were bare and often damp. Rats and mice were common companions, scuttling through corners in search of crumbs. Fleas infested the bedding, and lice clung to collars and hair. These were not accidental visitors. They were permanent fixtures of life below stairs. At night, the temperature dropped dramatically, especially in winter. Most servant quarters lacked fireplaces, and those that did possess them were rarely granted enough fuel to keep them burning through the night. Cold crept through stone walls and wooden beams, turning sleep into a shallow, fitful exercise. Servants learned to sleep curled tightly, limbs folded in on themselves to preserve heat. Some shared blankets. Others, if permitted, kept animals, cats or small dogs, for warmth. Even in summer, comfort was not assured. Humid air made the small spaces suffocating, and the stench of sweat and close bodies became nearly unbearable. Ventilation was poor, and the windows, if there were any at all, were tiny and often sealed shut to keep out pests or drafts. There were no soft sheets, no feather beds, no pillows embroidered with initials. A servant's bedding was a ticking stuffed with straw or hay, flattened from years of use and never truly clean. The fabric tore easily, releasing bits of stuffing that would scatter across the floor or become nesting material for vermin. Bedding was rarely washed, as the process of laundering was too time-consuming for something deemed so low in priority. Servants might air out their blankets in the sun on rare days off, beating them with sticks to remove fleas or dust, but otherwise, they simply endured the discomfort. Their own comfort was not seen as valuable. What mattered was that they were rested enough to work, not that they slept well or woke refreshed. In wealthier households, the hierarchy among servants extended even into their sleeping arrangements. Senior servants such as the steward, cook, or housekeeper might be granted a small room of their own, usually just large enough for a narrow bed and a wash basin. This tiny privilege marked years of loyalty and labor, yet even these quarters were sparse and austere. Meanwhile, the lowest-ranking staff, scullery maids, kitchen boys, stable hands, were crammed together in the most uncomfortable spaces, often sleeping near the tools of their trade. A kitchen boy might sleep beside the scullery sink. A stable hand might make his bed on a pile of hay beside the horses. These arrangements blurred the line between rest and work, reinforcing the notion that the servant's identity was never separate from their labor. Night did not always bring peace. Many servants remained on call well after the rest of the household had retired. A master might ring a bell from their chambers in the middle of the night, demanding a drink, a hot compress, or an errand to be run in darkness. Servants trained themselves to wake instantly at the sound, to move without hesitation, and to suppress the fatigue that clouded their eyes. Being slow to respond was not just a matter of inconvenience, it could result in punishment, or the loss of one's position. Some servants never truly slept, but instead hovered in a light doze, ears tuned for footsteps, bells, or voices calling from across the halls. Rest was conditional, not guaranteed. Dreams, if they came, were often disrupted. Hunger pangs gnawed at the stomach. Injuries throbbed from a day of physical exertion. Worries about mistakes made or chores undone played over in the mind. Servants lived with the knowledge that a single failure, whether real or perceived, could jeopardize everything. In some cases, nightmares plagued them, fears of being cast out, of their family being left to starve, or of dying nameless in a world that did not care. These anxieties were rarely spoken aloud. There was no time or space for emotional release, and few servants could afford to show vulnerability. Instead, they carried their worries silently, wrapped tightly around themselves like an extra layer of tattered cloth. Despite the darkness of these conditions, the servants' quarters also served as a place of camaraderie. In stolen moments between exhaustion and obligation, bonds were formed. Shared jokes, whispered stories, and the rare laugh became lifelines in a world that offered little else. Servants leaned on each other for comfort, sharing scraps of bread, secret tokens from home, or advice on how to handle a particularly cruel employer. These relationships, built on mutual suffering and shared resilience, offered something that the upper halls of the manor never did, a sense of human connection without pretense. Here, stripped of titles and roles, they were simply people, young and old, tired and hopeful, struggling to endure. Songs were sung in hushed voices, lullabies passed down from forgotten mothers or simple rhymes repeated to quiet younger servants. Some kept mementos hidden beneath their mattresses, a ribbon from a sibling, a piece of carved wood from a sweetheart, a letter never sent. These tiny relics of life outside service reminded them of who they were before they were pressed into labor. Sometimes, an older servant would tell stories of their youth, painting pictures of green fields, village fairs, or moments of joy that seemed impossible now. These stories were not always true, but they brought warmth to the cold nights and gave younger servants something to dream about, something to strive for, however distant. Still, as the hours passed, sleep eventually came, not as a luxury but as a necessity. The body could only resist fatigue for so long before it collapsed under its own weight. Servants slept curled around their pane, wrapped in rags, and blanketed by the sounds of their companions' breathing, turning, and murmuring in the night. They knew that rest would be short. The dawn would come quickly. The fire would need stoking. The floors would need sweeping. And the masters, oblivious in their feather beds, would once again call for their invisible hands to rise and serve. To be a servant in medieval times was to be constantly exhausted. It was to wake with sore muscles and fall asleep still dressed in yesterday's clothes. It was to live in a space that neither nourished the soul nor healed the body, but simply paused the relentless cycle of labor long enough to begin it all again. Yet within those small, hidden corners of the manor, behind the wooden doors and stone walls, the servants endured. Not with comfort, not with peace, but with quiet, shared strength that carried them from one day to the next, through countless sleepless nights, into a history that rarely remembered their names but was built upon their sacrifice all the same. In the structured world of medieval households, obedience was more than expected, it was demanded with unrelenting consistency. Servants were not just workers. They were considered part of a living mechanism meant to function flawlessly, hour after hour, day after day. Yet even the most diligent servant could falter. A misstep, an accidental spill, a moment of forgetfulness, or even the expression of a wrong emotion at the wrong time could be interpreted as defiance or incompetence. And when that happened, the system had its own way of responding. Discipline in medieval service was not merely correction. It was often public, painful, humiliating, and rooted in the belief that hierarchy had to be enforced through fear as much as order. Punishment varied widely depending on the master, the region, and the infraction. Some nobles were known for their strict but measured approach, delivering warnings or minor fines for small errors. Others, however, wielded their authority with unchecked cruelty. The law did not protect servants from abuse in most cases. They were property of the household in all but name, and their suffering was rarely questioned or defended by others. If a servant was struck, it was assumed they had done something to deserve it. If they were dismissed without pay, it was accepted as the master's right. The power imbalance was absolute, and those at the bottom of the household hierarchy knew better than to challenge it. Corporal punishment was a common response to perceived laziness or defiance. A kitchen maid who burned a stew might be slapped or beaten with a wooden spoon. A stable boy who forgot to shoe a horse could be struck with a riding crop. These were not isolated incidents but routine features of servant life. Bruises, welts, and even broken fingers were all part of the job. Some servants bore the marks of punishment quietly, hiding injuries beneath their clothing and learning to carry on without complaint. Others were subjected to more visible discipline, public scoldings, forced kneeling for hours in front of the household, or being locked in a pantry or cellar without food. The point was not just to correct a behavior, but to reinforce the power of the master and to discourage any notions of self-worth that might interfere with absolute submission. Verbal punishment was equally devastating. Servants were routinely insulted, belittled, and called by demeaning nicknames that erased their identities. Being called simple, slow, or worthless was part of the daily lexicon of reprimand, and it was not uncommon for servants to be mocked in front of guests for their mistakes. These words carved deep into the spirit, especially for younger servants just beginning their years of labor. They learned quickly that silence was safer than protest, that apology was never enough, and that even flawless work might go unrecognized if a single detail was overlooked. Dismissal was a punishment with potentially life-altering consequences. Being let go from a position, especially without a reference or recommendation, could doom a servant to poverty, homelessness, or worse. Medieval society did not have safety nets for the unemployed. A servant dismissed under suspicion of theft, disrespect, or poor performance might find themselves blacklisted among neighboring estates, unable to secure another position and left to fend for themselves in a harsh and unforgiving world. This threat loomed constantly over the heads of every servant, making them cautious in speech, timid in action, and intensely fearful of doing anything that might displease their employer, no matter how small or unintended. Sometimes, collective punishment was enforced when the master could not determine which servant was at fault. If a silver cup went missing, or if a guest's coat was mishandled, the entire servant staff might be punished until the guilty party confessed, or until someone else stepped forward to take the blame in order to protect the group. These situations bred distrust among servants, turning coworkers into competitors and friends into possible threats. The household became a stage of quiet rivalry, where loyalty was tested daily and self-preservation sometimes came at the cost of solidarity. The worst offenses, such as theft, lying, or insubordination, could lead to legal punishment outside the household's walls. In some cases, a master might report a servant to the local authorities, especially if they wanted to make an example of them or if the alleged crime involved money or property. These servants could find themselves facing public whipping, branding, or even imprisonment. The justice system was rarely lenient with the poor, and the word of a noble carried far more weight than the protest of a servant. A wrongfully accused servant had little recourse. Trials were swift, often one-sided, and punishments severe. In some towns, minor thefts were punished by cutting off fingers or placing the offender in the stocks for public humiliation. Despite these harsh realities, some servants developed coping mechanisms to survive the threat of punishment. They became experts in reading the moods of their masters, learning to anticipate emotional shifts before words were even spoken. They memorized the order of preferences, the layout of rooms, the patterns of footsteps down long corridors. They spoke in soft, calculated tones, moved with deference, and practiced a form of social invisibility that allowed them to avoid attention unless it was favorable. This form of emotional labor, constantly managing the feelings of others, was draining in ways that physical chores were not. It required constant performance, constant adaptation, and constant fear of failure. In the rare cases when a servant rose through the ranks, perhaps becoming a trusted valet, a lady's companion, or even a steward, they carried with them the memory of the punishments they had once endured. Some used their new positions to protect younger servants from abuse, softening the blows of criticism and shielding others from a master's wrath. Others became strict themselves, enforcing the same standards they had once suffered under, believing that this was simply the natural order of things. The cycle repeated itself, generation after generation, woven into the fabric of household tradition. Some households had written codes of conduct or rulebooks, but these were often vague, arbitrary, and applied inconsistently. Much depended on the temperament of the master or mistress, who might be indulgent one day and cruel the next. A servant who was praised for their diligence on Monday might be punished for perceived insolence on Tuesday. There was no stability, no predictability, and no system of appeals. Servants walked each day with caution in their steps and prayers on their lips, hoping that nothing they did, or failed to do, would awaken punishment. Punishment was not always visible or immediate. Sometimes it came in the form of isolation, being passed over for opportunities, or being denied a day of rest. A servant who had once joined in kitchen banter might find themselves suddenly silenced, frozen out by others who feared association. Trust was difficult to build and even harder to rebuild once broken. A stain on a servant's reputation, however undeserved, could linger like smoke in the air, affecting their treatment by others and their chances for future advancement. There were no second chances unless the master decided to grant them, and such mercy was rare. The fear of punishment shaped every aspect of a servant's existence. It determined how they stood, how they spoke, how they breathed in the presence of authority. It haunted their dreams and colored their waking thoughts. And yet, amid all of this, life went on. The floors were swept. The bread was baked. The children were dressed. The candles were trimmed. Service did not stop for bruises or broken pride. It simply carried forward, as relentless as the tolling of the bells that marked the hours. For many, the endurance of punishment was a point of quiet pride. They had survived. They had endured what others could not. And in surviving, they had proven their strength, not just of body, but of will. In this way, the harsh discipline of the medieval household forged a resilience that, while born from injustice, became a source of identity. It was not a resilience celebrated by history books or admired by noble guests. But it was real. It lived in every careful movement, every bowed head, and every silent night when a servant cried into their rough blanket, then rose the next morning and did it all again. When one imagines medieval life, the image that often comes to mind is a grand feast hall glowing with candlelight, the tables brimming with roasted meats, spiced pastries, and goblets of wine. Laughter echoes through the vaulted ceilings, minstrels play lively tunes, and the noble family reclines in comfort while guests toast to health and fortune. For those seated at the head of the table, it was indeed a time of celebration, indulgence, and festivity. But for the servant, whose hands prepared the food, whose arms carried the platters, and whose eyes remained trained on every detail to ensure the evening's perfection, these occasions represented not joy, but extraordinary exhaustion. Far from holidays, feasts and festivals were the most grueling, stressful, and punishing events on the servant calendar. Preparations for a major feast began days in advance. Even before the formal announcement, servants were expected to anticipate the additional workload. The cook would start drafting plans for dishes that required days of preparation, salting meats, pressing cheeses, drying herbs, and soaking grains. Orders would be made for fresh produce from the estate's gardens or nearby markets. If a boar or deer was to be served, someone had to arrange the hunt, the butchering, and the delivery of the meat. These logistics fell not on the shoulders of the master, but on the servants, who were expected to organize it all flawlessly and silently. For those working in the kitchen, it meant rising even earlier than usual, laboring late into the night, and moving constantly through thick smoke, open flames, and boiling pots with no time to rest. The physical demands of preparing a feast were staggering. Roasting a whole animal required hours of slow turning on a spit, usually the task of a young kitchen servant who stood near the heat until their face flushed and arms ached. Pastries had to be hand-mixed and shaped, sometimes in elaborate forms that mimicked birds, castles, or coats of arms. Spices, valuable and stored under lock and key, were dispensed carefully by a trusted steward or head cook, and woe to the servant who misplaced a precious pinch of cinnamon or clove. Every dish had to be precisely timed to be served hot, garnished correctly, and arranged in a way that would impress both guests and lords. Mistakes were not an option. A spoiled dish could shame the household. A late course could infuriate the master. And a clumsy spill in the great hall could bring public disgrace to the entire servant staff. On the day of the feast, the manor buzzed with activity from before sunrise until long after the last candle was extinguished. Floors were scrubbed, tapestries dusted, windows polished, and torches relit. Benches and tables had to be arranged, cups polished to shine, and all cutlery cleaned and counted. Decorations might be added, branches of greenery, embroidered banners, or displays of flowers from the garden. If visiting nobility were expected, guest rooms had to be aired out and refurnished, beds made, wash basins filled, and fires lit. Servants moved in a choreographed dance, each responsible for a dozen minor miracles that no one would ever notice unless something went wrong. There was no room for error, no margin for fatigue, and no break until the last dish had been washed and the last guest had departed. Serving the feast itself was its own test of endurance and discipline. Each servant had a designated role. Some poured wine, others carried dishes, and still more stood by with cloths to clean spills or remove empty plates. The high table was served first, with a ceremonial rhythm that demanded both precision and reverence. One wrong step, spilling wine on a guest, tripping over a rush mat, or addressing a noble incorrectly, could lead to a scolding in front of everyone or even dismissal. Servants were expected to remain quiet, focused, and unobtrusive. They had to remember dietary preferences, ensure that food was not too hot or too cold, and respond instantly to hand signals or subtle gestures. Their eyes were trained to scan for need without being obvious. Their ears listened without appearing to eavesdrop. Their bodies ached beneath stiff uniforms, but they stood straight and still. As the feast unfolded with laughter and music, the atmosphere among the servants was tense. The longer the event lasted, the more opportunities there were for mistakes. Wine flowed freely, and drunken guests could become rowdy or even aggressive, taking liberties with female servants or barking commands at those nearby. If a fight broke out, or a guest became ill from overindulgence, it was the servants who were expected to restore order without disturbing the revelry. Some guests treated the servants with kindness, but many saw them as part of the furnishings, expected to perform without acknowledgement or thanks. Even the musicians, who were sometimes from the servant class themselves, were required to play continuously without pause, their fingers stiff with fatigue and their throats sore from singing. Once the final course was served and the guests began to retire, the true labor for the servants began. Cleanup was a monumental task. Bones, crumbs, spilled sauces, and broken goblets littered the hall. Leftovers had to be sorted, some returned to the kitchens for reuse, others given to the poor at the gate, and a small portion, if any, reserved for the servants themselves. Platters were scrubbed, cups rinsed, and the floor swept multiple times to remove the grime of the evening. In some households, the rushes on the floor were replaced after feasts, requiring servants to haul in bundles of herbs, straw, or reeds to cover the flagstones once more. Wax drippings from candles had to be scraped from the tables, and furniture moved back into place. All of this was done in near silence, with exhaustion bearing down like a physical weight. Sleep would not come until the early hours of the morning, and even then, it was brief. The next day began like all others, with fires to stoke, water to fetch, and a house to maintain. Religious festivals, meant to be days of rest and worship, were often the opposite for servants. Celebrations like Easter, Christmas, and various saints' days brought guests, ceremonies, and special meals. The workload doubled or tripled. Servants were expected to dress in their finest, sometimes ill-fitting garments borrowed from the manor stores, and to perform duties with heightened grace. If the manor hosted a mass or a procession, servants might have to prepare the chapel, decorate altars, or coordinate with visiting clergy. They still had to rise before dawn, complete their usual chores, and remain present throughout the day. The joy of the holiday was something observed from a distance, not experienced. Even village festivals, such as harvest celebrations or summer fairs, offered no relief. While the nobles enjoyed games, dances, and banquets, the servants remained behind the scenes, managing the logistics. They prepared picnics, loaded wagons, cleaned up after bonfires, and served drinks to revelers. If games were played, it was the servants' task to fetch runaway balls or tidy the grounds. Rarely were they allowed to participate, and if they did, it was under close watch. Some households forbade servants from joining the festivities altogether, fearing misbehavior or mingling with outsiders. When permitted, their enjoyment was often short-lived, interrupted by duties or reprimands. And if anything went wrong during the celebration, a fight, a missing item, or a drunk guest causing trouble, it was the servants who bore the blame. The irony of these events was not lost on the servants themselves. Days that brought joy and abundance to the upper class only deepened the exhaustion and burden of those below. They witnessed beauty from the margins, handled luxury they would never own, and orchestrated happiness they could not share in. Some found pride in the smooth execution of these events, in the knowledge that their hard work brought admiration to the household. Others grew resentful, their spirits weighed down by the disparity between the lives they supported and the lives they endured. The music, the laughter, the scent of roasting meat, all became reminders of what they would never have. And yet, amid the chaos of a feast, moments of grace could be found. A shared glance between servants after a well-executed course. A rare leftover treat slipped discreetly into a pocket. The satisfaction of a clean haul at the end of the night. These moments did not erase the hardship, but they softened its edges. They became the small triumphs that made the exhaustion feel just a little less heavy. Servants leaned on each other in these times, their camaraderie forged not in leisure, but in shared labor. In a world that offered no reward beyond survival, these quiet victories mattered. As the candlelight dimmed and the embers cooled, the great hall returned to stillness. The laughter faded, the guests snored in their chambers, and the manor's pulse slowed to its usual rhythm. But for the servants, the memory of the feast lingered in sore muscles, raw hands, and aching feet. There was no applause for their performance, no recognition of the hours they had given. Just silence, cold air, and the knowledge that tomorrow would begin again. In the world of the medieval servant, a feast was not a celebration, it was a test. Of strength. Of patience. Of endurance. And time after time, they passed that test. Quietly. Invisibly. Completely. In medieval society, the position of a servant was not merely an occupation but a fixed social status. It was a role embedded into the very fabric of the feudal system, one that defined a person's worth, dictated their movements, and determined the limits of their dreams. To be a servant was to exist at the lowest rungs of the household hierarchy, just a step above the landless beggar or criminal in the eyes of the law, and always several steps below those who held land, titles, or wealth. This structure was not questioned, it was accepted as part of the natural order, reinforced by religious teachings, local custom, and the economic forces of the time. Servants were born into service, trained into obedience, and taught from a young age to understand their place within a world that thrived on keeping them exactly where they were. From the moment a child was deemed old enough to work, often by the age of 7 or 8, they were introduced to the strict codes of behavior expected of those in service. Some were sent away from home to live with another family, apprenticed in exchange for room and board. Others were born into households where their parents already served, and so their transition into labor came with little ceremony. The lessons were immediate and unforgiving. Do not speak unless spoken to. Always keep your eyes lowered, never contradict a master or mistress, and remember that your worth was measured in your ability to be useful. These rules were not only enforced by the masters but echoed by elder servants, who had internalized them through years of experience and hardship. The hierarchy within the servant class was as rigid as the one between servants and nobles, and any display of disobedience, arrogance, or laziness was quickly corrected, sometimes harshly. The servant was expected to embody humility in every gesture. From the way they dressed to the way they stood, walked, and spoke, everything about their appearance and behavior was meant to signal deference. They wore plain clothes and muted colors, often provided by the household, and were forbidden from adorning themselves with jewelry or fine accessories. Their hair was kept neat and simple, and they were discouraged from expressing individuality through fashion or demeanor. To do so risked being seen as prideful, a sin in the eyes of the church and an offense in the eyes of their employers. Even their posture had to reflect subservience. Standing too tall or too confidently could be interpreted as insolence, while moving too slowly could suggest laziness. The servant's life was a performance, one that required constant attention to detail and left little room for rest or self-expression. Outside of the manor or castle, a servant's reputation followed them. Everyone in the village knew who served where and under whom. A good position in a respected household could bring a degree of social stability, while a dismissal or scandal could ruin a servant's prospects indefinitely. Gossip traveled quickly in small communities, and even minor incidents, being accused of stealing a crust of bread, for example, could mark someone as untrustworthy for life. This constant scrutiny meant that servants had to maintain a carefully managed public image. They avoided confrontation, deferred to authority, and took great care not to offend anyone with power or influence. Their personal lives, if they had them at all, were conducted quietly and cautiously. Marriage among servants was not discouraged, but it was complicated by the nature of their work. Many households imposed strict rules about relationships among staff, fearing that romance would lead to distraction or unwanted pregnancies. Some masters forbade servants from marrying while in their employ, especially if housing was tight or if one of the partners served in a sensitive role, such as a personal attendant. In cases where marriage was permitted, couples often had to request approval, and even then, they might be separated by shifts, assignments, or even residence. Some servants married in secret or postponed marriage indefinitely, choosing instead to remain in service in hopes of saving enough for a modest future together. But saving money was difficult. Wages were low, and much of what was earned went toward basic survival: clothes, food, occasional medicine, and sometimes gifts or tokens for children or parents left behind in distant villages. Despite their hard work, servants were not considered part of the household family. They were part of the household mechanism. They ate separately, lived separately, and were rarely included in the emotional life of the manor. Even in cases where a servant had worked for the same family for decades, raising their children, managing their affairs, or caring for them in illness, they were still seen as the help. They could be dismissed without warning, replaced without a second thought, and forgotten once they were gone. There were exceptions, of course. Some families formed genuine bonds with their most loyal servants and showed them kindness in small ways: a better room, an extra blanket in winter, a kind word after a hard day. In rare instances, a servant might be remembered in a will or granted a pension. But these were outliers, not expectations. Most servants knew better than to grow too comfortable or to believe that affection translated into security. Religion played a complex role in reinforcing the servant's place in society. The Church taught that all people had their station in life and that to accept one's role with humility was a path to virtue and reward in the afterlife. Servants were told that their suffering and hard work would not go unnoticed by God, and that by serving their earthly masters faithfully, they were also serving a higher power. This belief brought comfort to some, helping them endure long hours and cruel treatment with a sense of purpose. Others struggled with the idea that their suffering was divinely ordained. They looked around at the injustices of the world, the wealth and ease of the nobility, the hunger of the poor, and questioned whether obedience really led to salvation. But questioning the social order too openly was dangerous. It could lead to accusations of heresy or rebellion, both of which carried severe consequences. Servants had few legal rights, and those they did have were difficult to enforce. The courts tended to side with the nobility, and complaints brought by servants were often dismissed without consideration. If a servant was beaten, cheated out of wages, or dismissed unfairly, their only recourse was to seek employment elsewhere, a task that became harder with every perceived stain on their record. Some servants carried letters of recommendation from previous employers, which could help secure new positions, but these were not guaranteed. In times of economic hardship, such as after a poor harvest or during a plague outbreak, the number of available positions shrank dramatically, and competition became fierce. Many found themselves wandering from manor to manor, offering their labor in exchange for food and shelter, hoping for a kind master and fearing the alternative. Education was almost entirely out of reach for servants. Most were illiterate, having had no access to schooling. Those who worked closely with literate masters, such as scribes, clerks, or stewards, might pick up bits of reading or arithmetic by observation, but formal learning was rare. This lack of education further cemented their place in society. They could not read contracts, write letters, or study the scriptures independently. They relied on others for information and communication, which left them vulnerable to deception and manipulation. It also limited their ability to improve their circumstances. Without literacy, apprenticeships were out of reach. Without apprenticeships, most trades were closed to them. They were bound, generation after generation, to the same cycle of servitude. Despite these constraints, the servant class played an indispensable role in the operation of medieval society. They were the ones who cooked the food, cleaned the homes, cared for the children, maintained the animals, managed the estates, and ensured that the world of the nobility continued to turn without friction. They moved silently through great halls, up and down stone staircases, in and out of freezing kitchens and shadowed cellars, carrying with them the weight of a system built on their shoulders. Their work was constant and largely invisible, but it was the foundation upon which castles were kept, cities were maintained, and aristocratic lives were lived in comfort. The servant's place in the social order was a paradox. They were everywhere, yet they were unseen. They were essential, yet they were expendable. They were disciplined, yet they were distrusted. They were loyal, yet they were unloved. And through it all, they remained, day after day, generation after generation, at the ready, bound not by chains but by the invisible expectations of a society that asked everything of them and gave almost nothing in return. In the intricate machinery of medieval households, perhaps the most heartbreaking cogs were the youngest servants, children who entered service before they truly understood what service meant. These were not children in the modern sense, protected by laws, nurtured in schools, or granted time to explore play and wonder. These were boys and girls often as young as 7 or 8, who left their family homes or were born into households where labor was expected the moment their small hands could carry a broom or hold a candle. Childhood, for them, was not a chapter of freedom, but a prologue to lifelong toil. Their innocence, while sometimes present in laughter behind the kitchen doors or in whispered songs before sleep, was always tethered to duty, obedience, and fear of punishment. In a world where survival required contribution, their small size and quickness became just another resource in the daily grind of the servant class. Many of these children entered service through arrangements made by their parents, agreements that promised food, shelter, and perhaps a bit of coin in return for their child's labor. For poorer families, this was not abandonment, but a form of care. In their minds, sending a child to a noble household was offering them a better chance at life than they could provide at home. Others were orphans or illegitimate children placed into service by the church or local authorities, swept into the folds of larger households as charity cases who were expected to repay their keep with unwavering labor. These arrangements were rarely questioned, and even less frequently documented. A child might enter service in one town and never return home, growing up in a place where they were surrounded by work but rarely by warmth. Life for these young servants began before sunrise, just like their older counterparts. Their size often dictated the roles they were assigned, tasks that required agility, crawling into tight corners, running errands up and down stairs, or navigating crowded kitchens with trays in hand. They were made to collect firewood, sweep ashes, scrub floors, and polish boots. Some were tasked with chasing rats from storage areas, their only tools a stick and sheer determination. Others were placed in kitchens, where they plucked feathers from poultry, scaled fish, or stood over steaming pots with tears in their eyes from smoke and onion fumes. The work was not adjusted for their age. It was simply assigned and expected to be done. If the task took too long, they were called lazy. If they did it poorly, they were shouted at. And if they cried, they were reminded that tears had no place in the servant's world. Discipline for children in service was rarely gentler than for adults. The belief of the time held that children were inherently unruly and required strict correction. A child who spilled milk, broke a dish, or spoke out of turn could be slapped, switched, or sent to bed without food. Their mistakes were seen as evidence of weak character rather than inexperience. Any act of mischief was considered a moral failing. Compassion was not entirely absent. Some older servants acted as protectors or mentors, softening the blows when they could, offering advice, or sneaking an extra crust of bread to a hungry child. But these small kindnesses were the exception. The rule was rigor. Childhood was not a protected space, but a stage of servitude under construction, a preparatory phase for the harsher demands that awaited in adulthood. Education for child servants was nearly non-existent. A few noble households employed tutors for their own children, and occasionally a curious servant child might linger nearby, listening quietly to lessons in Latin or arithmetic. But these moments were fleeting, and participation was almost never allowed. Servants were not encouraged to read, write, or ask questions. Knowledge was a privilege of rank, and curiosity from a servant child could be met with suspicion. The most they might learn formally were household protocols: how to address a lord, how to set a table, how to bow or curtsy correctly. These lessons were drilled into them not in classrooms, but through repetition and correction. A child who failed to master them quickly might find themselves transferred to dirtier work, or dismissed altogether. One of the cruelest aspects of life for young servants was the absence of play. While noble children enjoyed toys, games, and festivals designed for their amusement, servant children were kept busy. The manor did not pause for their boredom or their longing to explore. They had no wooden swords, no dolls dressed in lace, no painted spinning tops. Their toys were invented from scraps, twigs turned into dolls, pebbles arranged into games drawn into the dirt. Laughter, when it came, was hushed. Running or chasing each other through the corridors was discouraged or punished. Any sign of excess energy that disrupted the household's order was swiftly suppressed. Childhood imagination flickered dimly in the shadows of labor, kept alive only in secret corners and brief stolen moments. Holidays did not bring the kind of joy one might expect. While noble families celebrated with gifts, feasts, and entertainments, child servants were tasked with preparing those very occasions. They laid out decorations, fetched special foods, and served at tables they could never sit at. Occasionally, if a master or mistress felt generous, a small treat might be given: a honey cake, a ribbon, or a worn-out toy passed down from the nursery. These tokens were cherished, not just for their rarity, but for what they represented: a fleeting glimpse of kindness in a life built around utility. But such moments were infrequent, and they did little to change the course of a child's experience in service. The daily reality remained the same. They worked because they had to, not because they were ready. Friendships among servant children were both vital and fragile. They found comfort in each other's company, shared whispered stories while scrubbing flagstones, and exchanged secrets while hauling firewood. These friendships created a sense of belonging, a tiny rebellion against the isolation of the servant's life. But they were also easily broken by the demands of the household. A child might be transferred to another post, punished for talking too much, or separated by shifts that never aligned. Older servants sometimes discouraged these bonds, fearing they would lead to distraction or mischief. Even the masters occasionally intervened, viewing close friendships among servants as a potential threat to discipline. Despite this, the bonds formed among child servants were often the strongest they would know, built not on shared play but on shared struggle. In some households, servant children were required to tend to the noble children of the house, carrying them, dressing them, or cleaning up after their meals. These interactions were complex. On the surface, the children might be close in age, even friendly. A young maid might braid the hair of a girl barely older than herself, or a stable boy might be ordered to entertain a noble child with stories or simple games. But the boundaries were always clear. One was to serve, and one was to be served. A child who forgot their place, who joined in a game too eagerly or spoke too familiarly, might be scolded or removed from their post. Some noble children learned early to mimic the behavior of their parents, issuing commands, blaming mishaps on their servant companions, or treating them as props in their daily amusements. Others were kinder, offering crumbs of affection or protection, but even these gestures could not undo the fundamental divide that shaped their lives. As they grew older, child servants were expected to transition seamlessly into more demanding roles. There was no ceremony, no rite of passage. One day they were scrubbing pots, and the next they were expected to manage a hearth or care for an ill master. Puberty brought new expectations and new risks. Young girls were especially vulnerable, sometimes subjected to the unwanted attention of older male servants, or even members of the household. Their modesty was expected, their silence demanded. For boys, the shift often meant heavier labor, carrying loads, managing livestock, or assisting in trades. The expectations increased, but the support did not. There was no mentorship program, no formal training. They learned through mistakes, and mistakes were costly. Some children, over time, carved out spaces of agency for themselves. A clever boy might become a favorite errand runner for the steward, trusted with delicate tasks. A diligent girl might rise to the role of a lady's maid, gaining proximity to influence and perhaps better food or clothing. These were rare paths, but they existed. And yet, even in these roles, the ceiling remained low. No matter how well a child served, no matter how long they remained in the household, they were unlikely to rise above their station. The most they could hope for was security, a permanent position, consistent meals, and a place to sleep. Ambition, while not forbidden, was usually futile. For many servant children, their future was mapped out before they could read or write. They would serve until their bodies gave out. If they were lucky, they might marry another servant and share the burden together. If they were unlucky, they might fall ill, be dismissed, or age out of their usefulness. Their value was tied not to their character, their dreams, or their talents, but to their ability to serve without complaint. And yet, even within these constraints, their spirits endured. They found beauty in sunlight slanting through a window, in the quiet company of a kitchen cat, and the laughter of a friend who understood their world. These small joys became the threads that wove resilience into their hearts. The medieval world did not offer childhood as we know it today. It offered a compressed version of life, where youth was quickly traded for labor and innocence worn thin by expectation. For servant children, the manor was not just a place of work, it was a school of survival, a theater of endurance, and a home only in the loosest sense. And still, through hardship and heartache, they woke each morning, tied their aprons, and took up their place in the invisible army that kept the medieval household running. In a medieval servant's life, the passage of time was not measured in calendars or holidays, but by the changing demands of the seasons. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter each brought their own cycle of duties, their own burdens, and their own challenges. Unlike the nobility, who often marked the year with festivals, hunting trips, and visits to neighboring estates, the servant experienced the seasons as a shift in tempo rather than a break from labor. There was no season of rest. No time of year when the workload significantly lightened or where a servant might retreat for leisure. Instead, the changing weather simply meant the nature of the work shifted. What had been grueling in August became grueling in November, only in different clothing and under different circumstances. For those who served, the seasons brought neither romance nor reprieve, only a rotation of new tasks to master and new discomforts to endure. Spring was a time of renewal for the land, and for the household it meant thorough preparation for the busy year ahead. It was the season of cleaning, not in the gentle, modern sense of dusting windowsills, but in the backbreaking, hours-long effort of clearing soot from chimneys, hauling out old rushes from floors, scouring the walls of smoke residue, and scrubbing hearths that had burned since October without pause. The annual spring cleaning was a ritual as much as a necessity, a performance of order and health. Servants were expected to remove the lingering grime of winter's closed spaces and restore freshness to the manor before guests began to visit in greater numbers. Windows were opened wide, fabrics washed and aired, and all furnishings dragged into the courtyards to be beaten free of dust and pests. Alongside the cleaning came the reorganization of supplies. Root cellars had to be inspected for spoilage. Grain stores were checked, and the remaining winter preserves tallied and rationed. In estates with gardens, this was the time to begin planting. Young servants helped till the soil, carry compost, and tend to herbs and vegetables that would later flavor the meals of the noble household. In wealthier estates, gardeners were hired, but even then, servants were expected to support their efforts, fetching tools, watering beds, or harvesting early greens. The weather, still unpredictable, made everything more difficult. Rains turned paths to mud. Sudden frosts could kill new sprouts. But the rhythm of preparation could not be delayed. The manor had to be ready for summer's demands. Summer brought not leisure, but acceleration. With warmer weather came increased travel, more guests, and more elaborate meals. The kitchen swelled with activity as fresh produce became abundant. The workload multiplied, more fruits to preserve, more vegetables to chop, more poultry to pluck. Meals grew larger and more frequent, and the demands for perfection rose with the temperature. Servants worked in sweltering kitchens with little ventilation, sweat dripping from their brows as they turned spits and stirred bubbling pots over open flames. Outside, those responsible for the estate's grounds labored under the relentless sun. Lawns were trimmed with hand tools, paths raked, and hedges clipped with shears that dulled quickly. The house had to look its best for visiting relatives, traveling nobility, or seasonal festivals. In the servants' quarters, summer brought no comfort. The rooms were stifling, often without windows, the heat trapped in the stone walls. Bathing was infrequent and done with cold water, carried in buckets and poured into wooden tubs that had to be cleaned between uses. Insects thrived in the heat, fleas, lice, and flies buzzing through every corner. The smell of sweat and labor hung in the air, never quite dissipating no matter how often the floors were scrubbed or linens washed. Servants learned to pace themselves, to rest for a moment near cool stone walls or dip their hands in wash basins between tasks. But there was no real rest. The days were long, and the expectations even longer. Autumn was a time of preparation once again, this time for the cold that lay ahead. It was the season of gathering, storing, and preserving. Servants worked tirelessly to help bring in the harvest, not as field laborers, unless it was a small estate, but as assistants in cleaning, sorting, and storing the results. Grains had to be bagged, apples and pears laid out for drying, and herbs tied in bunches to hang from kitchen beams. Meat was salted or smoked. Butter was churned and stored in cool cellars. Everything had to be done quickly and carefully, before rot set in or the first frost made the work more difficult. Any mistake, spilled grain, poorly sealed jars, or failed curing, meant waste, and waste meant reprimand. It was also during autumn that the manor's fabrics were changed. Light linens were replaced with heavier wool. Curtains were swapped out, extra bedding laid in the master's rooms, and firewood gathered for the long winter ahead. Servants had to carry and stack logs, sweep chimneys, and patch gaps in doors or shutters to keep out the cold. Rats, sensing the changing season, began to creep closer to human dwellings. Traps were set, pantries reinforced, and stores checked daily for signs of infestation. The pace of the household shifted from outward show to inward care. The house folded in on itself, preparing for months where darkness lasted longer than light. And then came winter, the hardest season of all. With the snow and ice came silence, not because the work had stopped, but because the cold muffled even the sounds of labor. Servants still rose before dawn, but now they did so in rooms that were little more than iceboxes, pulling on stiff garments and forcing their feet into frozen shoes. The first task of the morning was to light the fires, and it was a task made infinitely more difficult by frozen kindling, damp logs, and trembling fingers. A servant could spend half an hour just trying to coax a fire into existence, blowing gently into soot-blackened embers, fingers numb and face stinging with cold. Failure was not an option. The house had to be warm before the masters stirred. Water had to be hauled despite frozen paths and icy buckets. Food had to be prepared, though the root cellar was frigid and everything needed thawing. The kitchen, paradoxically, became the warmest place in the house, and servants often lingered there when they could, if only to warm their hands or dry soaked cloaks. The work continued, cleaning, mending, serving, but now it was performed in layers of wool, with breath visible in the air and every surface cold to the touch. Illnesses spread quickly, coughs, fevers, and chills that never fully left. There were no doctors for the servants. A sore throat might be treated with a clove-studded apple or a cloth soaked in vinegar. A fever meant wrapping oneself in every available blanket and hoping for recovery. Festivities like Christmas offered brief change but no rest. While the masters celebrated with music and feasting, the servants worked even harder to prepare meals, decorate halls, and clean up after days of revelry. Some households gave their servants a single day off, Boxing Day, perhaps, where a small gift or leftover treat was offered. But even this was not guaranteed, and most spent the season just as they had the rest of the year, in motion, unseen, and indispensable. The seasons ruled the medieval world, but for servants, they brought no variation in privilege or peace. Only the texture of their suffering changed. Spring meant dampness and cleaning. Summer meant sweat and urgency. Autumn meant preparation and dread. Winter meant cold and silence. And through it all, the servant worked. Their bodies adjusted to the rhythms, their hands remembered the seasonal routines, and their minds braced for what was to come. There were no holidays, no sick days, no vacations. Just time, always ticking forward, asking more of them with every passing day. Yet, even within this relentless cycle, there were moments that rooted them to the world. The smell of freshly baked bread in a warm kitchen during winter. The flicker of candlelight reflecting off a polished plate just before a feast. The shared glance between servants when the fires finally caught in the hearth. The first snow, admired in silence before the work began. These were the pauses between burdens. Not enough to rest, but enough to remember that they were still human. For the servant, the seasons were not gentle. They did not arrive with poetry or celebration. They came with lists of tasks, aching limbs, and weather that seldom cared for human comfort. But the servant learned, endured, and adapted. Because there was no other choice. The seasons turned, and the servant turned with them, always moving, always working, always surviving. In the quietest corners of the medieval household, beyond the flicker of firelight and beneath the echo of daily commands, lived a truth so constant that it was almost invisible. The body of the servant was not their own. It was an instrument of labor, expected to rise with the sun and collapse only when the last task was done. It cooked meals without tasting them, cleaned rooms it would never rest in, and endured pain without pause or protest. While the noble body was pampered, perfumed, and protected, the servant body was worn down like the tools it used, scrubbed raw, bent low, and patched up just enough to keep going. Health was not a personal matter, but a practical one. If a servant could stand, walk, and work, they were considered well enough. And if they could not, they were often forgotten. The physical toll of servant life began early and lasted a lifetime. From the moment a child entered service, their body was enlisted into routines that demanded constant effort. Scrubbing floors on hands and knees wore the joints until they ached constantly. Hauling buckets of water up stone stairs strained shoulders and backs before they were fully developed. Working in smoky kitchens or near drafty doors took a quiet toll on the lungs and skin. Servants slept on hard surfaces, often in damp rooms, with little insulation from cold or pests. Illness was common, chronic coughs, skin infections, and stomach troubles that were never properly treated. But complaining about pain, even quietly, was seen as weakness. The strong endured. The weak were replaced. There were no doctors waiting in the servant quarters, no herbs laid out for their comfort, and no household physicians checking their pulses. Medical care, such as it existed in the medieval world, was largely reserved for the nobility. A noblewoman suffering from a headache might receive a lavender compress, a potion of chamomile and honey, or even a prayer whispered over her bed. A servant with the same symptoms was expected to finish sweeping the hall and be ready to serve supper by dusk. They might wrap a cloth around their head and keep working. They might dip a rag in cool water and wipe their brow. But rest was a luxury rarely afforded. Illness was something to be worked through, not around. Minor injuries were inevitable in every role. A kitchen maid might burn her hands on a cauldron or slice her finger on a dull knife. A stable boy might be kicked by a horse or thrown from a cart. These accidents were not seen as unusual. They were part of the risk of service. Some servants fashioned their own remedies, salves made from goose fat and herbs, poultices of moss or mashed roots. But often they simply bandaged the wound with scraps of linen and returned to their duties. Infection was a constant threat, especially with cuts and burns. Swollen fingers, discolored skin, and lingering pain were common signs that something was wrong. But if a servant could walk and carry a tray, they were expected to continue. The body was valued not for its comfort, but for its function. More serious illnesses, like fevers, pox, or plague, brought dread into every household. When disease spread, it did not distinguish between social classes, but the ability to respond to it certainly did. Nobles had access to isolation, travel, and care. Servants did not. If someone in the servant quarters fell ill, they were often removed from the household as quickly as possible, sent to nearby relatives if any existed, or abandoned in the village with little more than a blanket and a prayer. In large estates, an unused outbuilding or shed might be used as a place for the sick to die out of sight. Rarely was there an effort to treat the illness, only to contain it. This was not always the result of cruelty, but of fear. Disease moved quickly, and masters feared contagion more than they feared the loss of a single servant. For women in service, health risks were compounded by vulnerability. Female servants who worked closely with noble families, particularly those in bedrooms, dressing chambers, or nursery roles, were often subject to unwanted advances. Pregnancy, in such cases, was not only traumatic but dangerous. There was little recourse, no legal protection, and very little sympathy. A servant who became pregnant out of wedlock, regardless of the circumstances, was usually dismissed. The child, if born, might be taken to a foundling home or given away. Some women were forced to hide their condition, working through labor pains until they could no longer stand. Others attempted dangerous remedies to avoid giving birth at all. The risks to their health were enormous, and the consequences almost always borne alone. Malnutrition was another quiet killer. Servants did not starve outright. Most households provided basic meals, but the food they received was usually the scraps of what was left behind. Stale bread, thin pottage, and leftover grains made up the bulk of their diet. Meat was rare, fruit almost non-existent, and dairy saved for the masters. Their bodies, constantly in motion, burned through calories faster than they could replenish them. Weakness, dizziness, and fatigue were common, but expected. A servant who collapsed from hunger was more likely to be scolded than helped. Eating too much was frowned upon. Showing signs of hunger was seen as undisciplined. Servants learned to nibble, to make a crust of bread last the whole morning, to drink water to feel full. They worked on empty stomachs and dreamed of feasts they would never attend. Hygiene played a complicated role in a servant's health. While they were expected to keep the household clean, their own bodies were often neglected. Bathing was infrequent, especially in winter. Washing required hot water, space, time, and privacy, all of which were in short supply. Some households allowed servants to bathe once a week, others once a month. Soap was harsh and in limited supply. Clothes were worn until they were threadbare and rarely washed unless soiled. Vermin were a constant companion: lice, fleas, and mites that lived in bedding, hair, and clothing. Servants scratched discreetly, shared tips for herbal remedies, and endured the discomfort without complaint. Skin infections, sores, and rashes were common and accepted as a part of life. Mental health, though not understood in medieval terms, was another silent realm of suffering. Servants lived under constant pressure, to please, to avoid mistakes, to endure long hours, to manage pain. They were isolated from their families, cut off from support, and denied any space for personal reflection. The stress of this life wore down the spirit. Some became numb, moving through their tasks like ghosts. Others grew anxious, always fearing the next reprimand or dismissal. Depression was not named, but it was deeply felt. A servant who grew listless or quiet was often accused of laziness or ingratitude. There were no words for trauma or exhaustion, only the expectation to keep going. And yet, somehow, they did. They worked with sprained ankles, with toothaches, with sore throats and open blisters. They limped through the halls, tied cloth around wounds, and bit back coughs so as not to seem weak. Some found small ways to heal. A cup of warm broth made by a friend. A moment by the hearth to thaw aching hands. A stolen nap in the broom closet when no one was looking. These acts of care, however small, became survival strategies. The body may not have been their own, but they did what they could to preserve it. There were rare households where masters showed kindness, where injured servants were allowed to rest, given herbs, or tended to with genuine concern. In such places, a servant might recover from illness and return to work slowly. But these were the exceptions, not the norm. In most cases, the body was expected to perform until it could not. And when it failed, the servant was replaced, their absence noted briefly, if at all. No plaques were carved for the hands that scrubbed the stairs. No hymns were sung for the backs that bent beside the hearth. But without those bodies, aching, bruised, tired, the medieval household would have collapsed. Their health was never a priority, yet their labor was vital. And so, in silence and in pain, they carried the weight of a world that never truly saw them. In a world where permanence was elusive and the line between fortune and failure was thin, loyalty was often the most treasured virtue a medieval servant could possess. For some, a lifetime of service within the same household was not only a possibility, but the defining shape of their existence. They arrived as children, learned the routines and expectations of the manor, and grew old in its corridors, their faces becoming as familiar to the stone walls as the carved tapestries or wooden beams. These long-serving individuals, though still viewed as lesser by social class, often earned a quiet place of respect within the household, their loyalty spoken of during feast days or acknowledged in rare moments of noble generosity. And yet, for all their dedication, the fate of even the most loyal servant remained deeply entwined with the fate of the household they served. When a master died, a lord was deposed, or a family fell from wealth, the servant's entire world could unravel in a matter of days. The death of a master sent ripples through the household that extended far beyond mourning. For the noble family, grief might be accompanied by ceremony, inheritance, and solemn rites. For the servants, it often meant uncertainty, upheaval, and fear. While the noble heirs moved to secure their rights and redistribute responsibilities, the servants braced for change. Some were immediately dismissed, their employment tied directly to the individual who had passed. A lady's maid, for example, might find herself without a position if the lady of the house died, regardless of years of faithful attendance. A valet could be deemed unnecessary by the new lord, especially if he preferred his own staff or sought to reduce household expenses. Those allowed to remain often faced a reshuffling of duties, rooms, and routines. A new master might bring with him different expectations, new rules, and unfamiliar customs. Relationships built over decades were suddenly rendered obsolete, replaced by transactions and unfamiliar demands. For elderly servants in particular, the transition could be devastating. Their bodies were no longer suited to hard labor, yet their presence was often seen as a burden rather than a legacy. Without the patronage of the master who had once trusted them, they were at the mercy of the new household's goodwill. Some were sent away with a modest pension or a small chest of belongings. Others were simply told to leave. Not all changes were prompted by death. The shifting tides of politics, war, and economy could force a noble household to downsize, relocate, or dissolve entirely. A family that once maintained a manor with dozens of staff might suddenly find themselves retreating to a smaller estate, unable to afford the wages and upkeep of their former life. In such moments, servants were among the first to feel the consequences. They were laid off, passed between relatives, or left to seek work elsewhere. Without written contracts or legal protections, they had no claim to severance, no guarantee of future employment, and often no place to go. Their years of loyalty, while occasionally remembered in a farewell blessing, were not enough to secure a livelihood. There were, however, stories, rare but powerful, of masters who honored their servants beyond expectation. A trusted steward might be gifted a small cottage or plot of land upon the master's death, his name included in the will alongside the noble heirs. A nursemaid who raised generations of children might be invited to live out her final years in relative comfort, cared for by those she once tended. These acts of generosity were spoken of for generations, sometimes even commemorated in village churches or local histories. Yet for every such tale, there were countless others lost to silence, where loyalty was met with indifference, and old age with loneliness. The emotional bond between servant and master was complex. Years of service often bred familiarity, and in some cases, even affection. A valet who had dressed a lord for 30 years might know the man's moods better than his own wife. A chambermaid might recognize the sound of her mistress's footsteps from across the hall, anticipating her needs before they were spoken. These relationships were built on routine, proximity, and mutual dependency. Yet they were rarely equal. The affection of a master, no matter how genuine, was filtered through a hierarchy that always placed the servant one step below. Gratitude was expressed with gifts or kind words, but not always with protection or provision. And so, when loss came, whether through death, disgrace, or change of fortune, it was often the servant who suffered most quietly and most deeply. Some servants, having lost their positions, wandered from estate to estate in search of new employment. Others returned to the villages of their birth, often finding that time had passed them by and the homes they once knew were no longer theirs. A few entered monastic life, choosing the structure and stability of religious service as a refuge from the uncertainty of secular labor. Still others, especially those too old or frail to work, relied on the charity of parish relief or the kindness of former employers' descendants. Their lives, once bound by the walls of a single household, became uncertain paths of dwindling options and silent memories. For those who remained in service until their death, the end came quietly. There were no funerals with incense or choir songs, no family crypts or marble headstones. A servant might be buried in a small parish graveyard, their name marked with a simple cross, if at all. Sometimes fellow servants collected a small fund to pay for burial. Sometimes the household covered the cost, though not always with ceremony. The stories of their lives, the years spent laboring in silence, the rooms they kept clean, the meals they prepared, the children they raised, vanished with them, unrecorded and unremembered. Yet without these lives, the history of every great house would be hollow. The walls may have stood, the names may have been recorded, but it was the servants who kept the heart of the house beating. There were, of course, moments of dignity and meaning in a servant's long service. Some took pride in their routines, in the polished brass, the neatly folded linen, the steaming bread pulled from the oven at just the right time. They knew the rhythms of their household like a musician knows a song, their movements in tune with the rising and falling needs of the day. There was satisfaction in a job done well, in the quiet acknowledgement of a task completed without complaint. These were not grand victories, but they were real. And in a life defined by service, such moments became the foundation of identity. In the end, the loyalty of the medieval servant was a form of quiet courage. It was the willingness to return each morning to the same tasks, the same expectations, the same invisible role, day after day, year after year, without promise of reward or recognition. It was a faith not in fortune or fame, but in routine, in responsibility, and in the hope that their efforts made someone's life a little easier, that their presence brought order to a world too often ruled by chaos, that they mattered, even if only in the quietest ways. In a life so thoroughly consumed by repetition and responsibility, the idea of a day off for a medieval servant may seem like a contradiction. The rhythms of their world did not slow. The fires still needed to be lit, the floors swept, the animals tended, the meals prepared. Yet even in the most rigid and demanding of households, there existed small, fleeting pauses in the labor, a few hours stolen from the routine, perhaps a full day if the master was especially lenient or tradition required it. These were not holidays in the modern sense, with travel plans, leisure activities, or extended sleep. Rather, they were modest interludes, moments where the weight of duty eased just enough for a servant to remember that they existed apart from their tasks. These rare opportunities for rest, however brief or restricted, were both a gift and a test, how to rest, when one never truly learned how. In many manors and estates, the possibility of time off came most reliably with religious observance. The medieval world was deeply rooted in the rhythms of the church, and holy days, of which there were many, offered structured opportunities for withdrawal from regular labor. Feasts such as Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost were marked by prayer, fasting, or celebration, and some households allowed their servants to observe these days with reduced duties. On such occasions, the main work of the house was paused, or at least simplified, in honor of the day's significance. But even these holy days were not guaranteed breaks for the servant class. Their time off was contingent on the household's needs. A large family gathering, a visiting dignitary, or a master with particular religious preferences might override any hope for rest. If a feast required a special meal, then the kitchens would work overtime. If guests needed extra rooms prepared, the maids would clean and set beds long into the night. When a true day off did occur, it was often centered around a Sunday, the day designated by the church as one of rest. In some areas, local custom protected this tradition with mild enforcement. Shops closed, laborers paused their work, and even the busiest manors might shift into a slower gear. Servants, if granted the privilege, could attend morning mass without having to rush back immediately. For some, this was the only time in the week they saw their family members, friends, or even the wider village community. A walk to the church, wearing one's best if modest clothes, was a chance to reclaim a sliver of identity. They might exchange quiet greetings with other servants from nearby estates, share whispered updates, or simply enjoy the feel of sunlight on their face without a broom or tray in hand. Beyond church attendance, a day off offered different things to different servants. For the younger ones, it was a time to breathe, to sit without being summoned, to stretch limbs sore from endless errands. For older servants, it was a chance to mend their garments, clean their shoes, or nurse an aching back. Some took to journaling, if they had the rare skill of literacy, while others might carve bits of wood, sew small trinkets, or prepare modest gifts for family members they rarely saw. These activities were quiet, solitary, and humble, but they restored a sense of personhood that was so easily stripped away in daily labor. The few hours where one could exist without direction or demand were precious beyond measure. Occasionally, days off coincided with local fairs or village celebrations. These events, while still grounded in religious or seasonal themes, were more spirited in nature. A servant lucky enough to attend might walk among merchants, listen to music, watch traveling performers, or even participate in simple games. Money was limited, but the sights and sounds were free. Children chased each other around market stalls. Couples exchanged furtive glances behind hay carts. Laughter drifted on the breeze, mingled with the smell of spiced pies or roasting meats. For a servant who lived within the walls of a manor, such moments were vivid reminders that the world was bigger than hearths and hallways. They might purchase a small treat, an apple coated in honey, a bit of cheese wrapped in cloth, or simply stand at the edge of the crowd, watching, remembering what it felt like to smile without needing permission. Romance, too, was often reserved for such moments of pause. The strict hierarchy and separation of roles within the manor made courtship among servants a delicate endeavor. There were rules to follow, risks to consider. But on a day off, with eyes less watchful and time more flexible, couples might steal away for a walk beyond the manor grounds or exchange notes in secret corners of the village. Love among servants was rarely adorned with luxury or poetry. It was built on shared hardship, whispered hopes, and small gestures, a hand brushed while gathering linens, a smile exchanged across a crowded kitchen, a shared crust of bread eaten in silence. Days off were when these connections grew, nourished in the brief absence of command. But rest was not always peaceful. Many servants, especially those newer to the household, struggled with the sudden absence of direction. They had grown so used to being told what to do, when to do it, and how to do it, that time to themselves felt unfamiliar. Some would pace the quarters, anxious about what was expected of them next. Others would spend their time off cleaning their own meager belongings, organizing their space, or preparing for the next day's tasks. The weight of responsibility lingered even in rest, and many found it difficult to truly relax. There was also the ever-present fear that taking too much time for oneself might be noticed and disapproved of. A servant seen laughing too loudly, resting too long, or speaking too freely on a day off might be reminded, gently or otherwise, that they were never truly off duty. Older servants often spent their time off in stillness, their energy worn thin by years of unrelenting work. They might sit by a small window, watching the trees sway in the wind, their hands folded in their lap. For them, rest was not about enjoyment but recovery. They counted their blessings quietly: a warm drink, a bit of sunlight, the absence of pain for a brief spell. These were not grand comforts, but they were meaningful in their own way. Some reflected on the years behind them, remembering other houses, other masters, faces long gone. They did not expect luxury or ease. They asked only for a little quiet, a place to sit, and the grace of being left alone for a few hours. Even within the walls of the manor, there were places that felt almost restful on such days. The kitchens, when not in full swing, retained a gentle warmth and the smell of spices lingering in the air. The gardens, tended carefully through the seasons, offered the rustle of leaves, the hum of bees, and the whisper of wind through hedges. A servant might sit beneath a tree, gaze at the clouds, and imagine a different life. Perhaps they once dreamed of being a weaver, a painter, or a storyteller. Perhaps they dreamed of owning a little cottage on the edge of a forest. These dreams were rarely spoken aloud, but on days of rest, they came to visit, soft, uninvited, and bittersweet. Some households acknowledged their servants' need for rest with small acts of kindness. A cook might allow the kitchen boys to eat first that day. A housekeeper might permit a longer break in the afternoon. A master might offer a kind word or an extra coin, though such gestures were uncommon. These allowances were not required by law or tradition. They were expressions of humanity in a system that often forgot to include it. And though modest, they were remembered. A servant might carry the memory of that one kind day for years, using it as quiet fuel through harder times. As evening fell on a day off, the rhythm of duty crept back in. Clothes were laid out for the morning, tools inspected, shoes cleaned. The quarters grew quiet again, lit by the soft glow of oil lamps or candles. Some servants whispered prayers before sleep, asking for strength, protection, or simply endurance. Others lay awake, thoughts drifting through memories of the day, a bird they saw on the windowsill, a piece of sweet bread tasted for the first time, a brief glance from someone they loved. These small joys, often forgotten by the world beyond, were treasured deeply. Because for the servant, a day off was not just rest. It was remembrance. A fleeting, fragile return to self. In a life governed by duty, the rare gift of rest reminded the servant that they were not only hands for hire, but human beings, capable of dreaming, feeling, and quietly hoping. These pauses, brief as they were, did not stop the wheel of service from turning. But they gave the soul a moment to breathe. And sometimes, that was enough to carry them into the next day. Across the grand sweep of medieval history, through wars, coronations, plagues, and the rise and fall of kingdoms, there lies a vast and quiet absence. Not of events or inventions, but of names. Names that once belonged to the men and women who kept the tapestries dusted, the chambers warm, the livestock fed, and the hearth fires crackling. Servants, ever present in the background of daily life, rarely left footprints in the written record. They were not memorialized in stained glass windows or carved into the stone of churches. They did not appear in family chronicles, unless as footnotes to scandal or crime. They had no heraldry, no ancestry traced in velvet-lined books. And yet, without them, the grand halls of history would have stood silent, cold, and empty. The nature of their disappearance from record is not an accident. It is a reflection of how medieval society valued lives, not by their toil or kindness or endurance, but by their status and bloodline. Chroniclers recorded the speeches of kings, the sins of nobles, and the scandals of courtly life, while servants moved like ghosts behind the page. Their words were unrecorded, their stories untold. Their work, though constant, left little behind but polished floors, warm meals, and neatly arranged garments. Yet within the silence of history's parchment, there remains an echo of footsteps before dawn, of laughter in servant halls, of whispered prayers before sleep. To find the servant in medieval history is not to find a portrait or a diary. It is to feel the presence of someone who made life livable for others while being denied the dignity of remembrance. The few surviving mentions of individual servants often appear in legal documents, household account books, or letters written by the elite. A cook may be named in a list of pantry expenses. A stable boy might be recorded in a court case involving a runaway horse. A chambermaid could be mentioned in passing during a noble's will, perhaps granted a token sum for faithful service. These fragments offer glimpses of the real people behind the roll. We see that they had wages, however small. That they sometimes moved between households. That they owned little, but were often entrusted with much. Their appearances are brief, but in those short lines of Latin or Old English, we find evidence that they lived, labored, and mattered. Some of the most detailed records of servant life come from larger institutions, monasteries, royal courts, and urban households. Royal servants, in particular, were more likely to be documented due to the sheer volume of administrative oversight. From these records, we learn about wages, uniforms, and expectations. We discover that certain positions came with livery, meals, and housing. That cooks, butlers, and laundresses sometimes handled immense responsibility. That valets and ladies' maids were privy to secrets, gossip, and the daily rhythms of the most powerful people in the realm. But these records are still impersonal. They describe positions more than people. They tell us what a servant did, but rarely who they were. The voices of the servants themselves are even rarer. Letters written by servants are nearly non-existent, both because literacy was uncommon and because few had the means or reason to write. When they did, it was usually to petition for help, forgiveness, or employment. These letters are often formulaic, dictated by a scribe or copied from templates. But within their lines, a quiet humanity breaks through. A plea from a dismissed maid asking to be rehired. A note from a loyal footman expressing gratitude for a winter coat. A message sent to a distant sibling, reporting that all is well, and the work is steady. These letters, when preserved, are fragile threads to a forgotten world, a world where the servant's voice was rarely heard but always present. Art offers a different kind of record. In illuminated manuscripts, wall paintings, and tapestries, servants sometimes appear at the edges of scenes. They are shown pouring wine, kneeling beside a fire, or carrying trays. Their faces are often anonymous, their bodies stooped in service. Yet their presence in art reminds us that they were there, not imagined, but real. They stood beside the thrones, behind the tables, beneath the banners. They watched as treaties were signed, as nobles danced, as lords fell ill and died. They were the silent witnesses to history's loudest moments. And though their likenesses may be generic, they remind us that behind every noble household was an army of workers whose hands made the pageantry possible. Folklore and oral history preserve some of the humanity that written records forgot. In rural villages, stories passed down over generations sometimes mention Old Meg the cook, or Thomas the groom who knew every horse by name. These tales, though embroidered by time, hint at the personalities that once filled the roles of servant. They speak of clever maids who saved the manor from fire, of brave footmen who protected their masters from robbers, of kind nannies who raised children more gently than their own parents. These stories live in memory, not archives. They reflect the deep imprint that a good servant could leave, not in the annals of history, but in the hearts of those they served. Graveyards, too, tell quiet stories. In some churchyards, especially in small parishes, you might find modest headstones marking the final resting places of longtime servants. The inscriptions are simple. Faithful in service, a good and honest man, served the house of Hawthorne for 40 years. These stones stand among grander monuments, yet they carry a different kind of weight. They speak of a life spent in humble labor, of loyalty without fame. And while many servants were buried without markers, their bones mingled with the earth of the villages they kept running, these few named stones are powerful reminders that even the most invisible lives leave traces. The invisibility of servants in historical memory has modern consequences. It reinforces the idea that only the powerful shape history, that only the wealthy deserve to be remembered. But the truth is that every great historical figure was dressed, fed, and cared for by someone else. Every grand building was cleaned by unseen hands. Every royal procession was prepared by people who stood just outside the frame. Their absence from textbooks and museums is not a reflection of their insignificance, but of society's failure to value the labor that sustains daily life. To remember the servants is to reframe history, not as the story of a few exceptional individuals, but as the shared effort of countless unnamed contributors. Efforts to recover these stories are growing. Historians now study servant records with greater interest, combing through account books, tax rolls, and parish registers to reconstruct lives once deemed too ordinary to preserve. Museums and documentaries are beginning to include the perspectives of household staff, not just the lords and ladies who employed them. Novels, films, and plays increasingly imagine the world from the servant's view, giving voice to those who were long silent. These cultural shifts are more than acts of fiction. They are gestures of respect, efforts to restore balance, and invitations to understand history more completely. To imagine the life of a medieval servant is not just an act of empathy, but an act of historical justice. It means acknowledging that every warm meal, every clean garment, every blazing hearth we read about in noble journals came at the cost of someone's labor. It means understanding that the comfort of the few was built on the exhaustion of the many. And it means recognizing that within every nameless entry in a manor account book was a person, with fears, hopes, laughter, and pain. As we walk through the great halls of castles and palaces today, admiring the tapestries, the furniture, the grandeur of it all, we might pause and imagine the footsteps that once echoed softly through the servants' passages. We might wonder who folded the sheets on the Lord's bed, who chopped the wood for the fire that warmed the nursery, who held the lantern on a dark winter night as the lady of the house returned from chapel. These small acts, repeated over years and generations, formed the true architecture of medieval life. Not just stones and mortar, but care and labor. The forgotten faces of medieval history are not truly gone. They live in the worn thresholds, the soot-darkened beams, the handwritten margins of household ledgers. They live in the echo of work done without praise. And now, at last, they live again in memory, as essential, as human, and as worthy of remembrance as any crowned king. Though the medieval servant rarely made their mark in stone or song, their influence did not vanish with the passage of centuries. In fact, the structure, routine, and discipline of medieval domestic service laid the foundations for a system of labor and hierarchy that would continue to evolve, adapt, and influence modern society in ways that are still visible today. The legacy of their work, their routines, their struggles, their silent endurance, can be traced in the households of later generations, in the rise of professional service roles, and in the lingering social assumptions about labor, status, and the invisible workforce behind every well-ordered life. To understand the servant's place in history is not simply to look backward into a forgotten past, but to see clearly the roots of much that still surrounds us. The basic structure of servant life, defined by hierarchy, obedience, and division of labor, persisted long after the medieval period ended. The transition into the Renaissance and early modern period brought changes in architecture, clothing, and thought, but the servant's world remained deeply familiar. Large households continued to rely on teams of domestic workers, each assigned specific roles with clearly defined boundaries. Maids, cooks, valets, and stewards remained staples of noble life. What began in the medieval manor, this careful orchestration of human effort, was refined, expanded, and eventually codified into a system recognizable in the stately homes of the Victorian age and beyond. In the grand estates of the 18th and 19th centuries, for example, the rules and expectations of medieval service were echoed in new forms. The rigid etiquette, The emphasis on silence and invisibility, the grueling hours and limited rights, all persisted, now enhanced by uniforms, manuals, and written contracts. The downstairs of these houses became a world unto itself, not unlike the servant quarters of medieval times, complete with its own customs, hierarchies, and invisible walls separating those who served from those who were served. The butler, the housekeeper, the footman, each role had its origins in the practical needs and social customs of the medieval household. But the influence of medieval service extended beyond grand houses. As urbanization spread and the middle class grew, the concept of domestic help filtered into more modest homes. Middle-class families hired maids, nursemaids, and cooks, mimicking the social structure of the nobility in miniature. Even without vast wealth, the idea of being served remained a marker of status and respectability. The language of service, terms like help staff and retainers, was inherited directly from earlier centuries, and with it came attitudes about obedience, humility, and propriety. The medieval view that a servant was a fixture of the household, an extension of its order and prestige, did not vanish, it simply adapted. The rhythms of a servant's life, early rising, attention to detail, unquestioning execution of commands, shaped expectations not just within the home, but within society more broadly. As industrialization progressed, many of the values ingrained through centuries of domestic service were transplanted into factories and offices. Punctuality, submission to authority, and repetitive, skill-specific labor were all qualities honed in the medieval servant class and repurposed for the emerging workforce. Employers valued workers who followed orders without complaint, who performed their tasks methodically, and who accepted their position in a hierarchy without protest. The servant's discipline became the model for a new kind of economic productivity. Even cultural ideas about cleanliness, decorum, and respectability owe a debt to the domestic systems perfected in the medieval manner. The servant was the keeper of order, the silent guardian of routines. It was their labor that ensured fires were lit, meals appeared on time, and floors remained swept. Over time, these expectations became social norms, and eventually moral imperatives. A clean house, a well-dressed family, a timely dinner, these were no longer just signs of wealth, but of virtue. And while the servants who maintained these appearances often went unseen, their standards became deeply embedded in the values of the societies they served. The invisibility of the servant's contribution, so profound in medieval times, has proven enduring. Even today, many forms of labor remain hidden behind the scenes: cleaners, cooks, delivery drivers, caretakers. They make life easier for others, often with little acknowledgement or appreciation. The dynamic of dependence without recognition, so familiar in the medieval world, still lingers in the structure of modern service industries. The idea that someone should work while another rests, that tasks should be completed quietly, perfectly, and without complaint, remains a powerful expectation. And while today's workers have legal protections and rights unknown to their medieval counterparts, the legacy of silent, invisible labor continues to shape both experience and perception. Yet alongside this legacy of invisibility is another inheritance, one of quiet dignity. The medieval servant, though denied status and often affection, lived a life of perseverance. Their efforts, repeated daily with little fanfare, created stability in an unstable world. They embodied a kind of strength rarely celebrated in history books, but no less vital. The endurance required to rise each day, to complete each task, and to remain composed under pressure was itself a legacy, a model of resilience and discipline that has continued to inspire stories, songs, and quiet respect. Modern media has begun to explore this dynamic more openly. Films, television series, and novels have taken interest in the world below stairs, portraying the complexity, humanity, and strength of domestic workers throughout history. From the fictional kitchens of historical dramas to memoirs of service in real aristocratic homes, the servant's perspective has become a lens through which we reassess the past, and ourselves. These portrayals remind us that behind every polished surface, there is effort. Behind every moment of ease, someone labored. And behind every great name in history, countless others toiled in silence to make their achievements possible. Education, too, has expanded to recognize the value of these forgotten figures. Historians now examine the working lives of ordinary people with as much care as they once gave to kings and generals. The social history movement, born in the 20th century, has cast a light into the servants' quarters, reading between the lines of estate records and household accounts to reconstruct the daily lives of those once deemed unworthy of attention. Museums have followed suit, offering exhibits on domestic work, featuring tools of the trade, reconstructed kitchens, and even preserved servant quarters. These efforts, while recent, are a meaningful step toward honoring lives once lost to history's margins. In many ways, the legacy of the medieval servant invites a broader reflection on what it means to live a life of labor. To work not for glory, but for necessity. To build not monuments, but comfort. To serve not from weakness, but with quiet strength. These lives challenge the idea that only the powerful shape the world. They remind us that the world is also shaped by hands that make the beds, sweep the floors, and bring the food to the table. The social inequalities that defined the medieval household have not disappeared, but awareness of them has grown. Conversations about fair wages, labor rights, and the dignity of work are part of this legacy. Every policy protecting workers, every demand for fair treatment, stands on the shoulders of those who had none. The servant's story, once erased, is now a foundation. It asks us not only to remember but to act, to ensure that those who serve are no longer forgotten. As we reflect on the life of the medieval servant, we do not just look into the past. We look into the mirror. We ask how we treat those who serve us, directly or indirectly. We consider the systems we live within, the comforts we enjoy, and the unseen labor that supports them. And in doing so, we honor not just history, but humanity. The medieval servant may have lived in shadows, but their legacy surrounds us. It is in every routine we follow, every system we inherit, and every moment of rest that was bought somewhere, by someone else's effort. They were the unseen heart of a world in motion. And in remembering them, we bring them into the light. And now, as we leave behind the stone corridors, the quiet servant quarters, and the slow, steady rhythm of a world long gone, take a moment to breathe. You've spent time in the footsteps of those history rarely remembers, those whose lives were built on labor, structure, and sacrifice. In the flicker of candlelight, in the hush of dawn, in the creak of wooden stairs under tired feet, the story of the medieval servant unfolded, not as a tale of grand events, but of quiet endurance. If this journey helped you drift into rest or offered a peaceful escape into the past, we're glad to have shared it with you. You're always welcome here, in this quiet corner of history. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to join us again. You can share when and where you're listening from, or simply let us know if this helped bring you comfort tonight. Until next time, may your sleep be deep, your dreams gentle, and your heart light. Good night.